Well, let's go ahead and kick things off. Thank you for those of you listening and joining. Welcome to Ethics in Tech with Reid Blackman, PhD. Reid is the founder and CEO of Virtue Consulting, where he works with companies to integrate ethical risk mitigation into the development, procurement, and deployment of emerging tech products. He's the author of the book Ethical Machines, forthcoming from Harvard Business Review Press, so keep an eye out for that. He sat on Ernst & Young's Artificial Intelligence Advisory Board. He's a member of IEEE's Ethically Aligned Design Initiative and is the Chief Ethics Officer of the Government Blockchain Association. Reid's work has been profiled in the Wall Street Journal and Dell Perspectives, and he has contributed multiple pieces to the Harvard Business Review, TechCrunch, and VentureBeat. He's regularly quoted in the news media and delivers keynote addresses to organizations in industry, nonprofit, and academia. Recent ventures include the World Economic Forum, SAP, Can Leon, AIG, Forbes, NYU Stern School of Business, and Columbia University. Prior to founding Virtue, Reid was a professor of philosophy at Colgate University and the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. His research appeared in numerous prestigious professional journals, including the European Journal of Philosophy, the Canadian Journal of Philosophy, and I'm going to mispronounce this. I'm going to pass the baton.
So like Arkentis?
Or Kentness.
Nobody cares, though. It's fine.
Academia world, probably well-known journal name. He also founded a fireworks wholesaling company and was even a flying trapeze instructor. Reid received his BA from Cornell University, his MA from Northwestern University, and his PhD from the University of Texas at Austin. So welcome, Reid. So good to be here with you today.
Thanks for having me, and thank you for implicitly telling me I need to shorten that bio.
It's always different in writing, and then you hear it.
Oh, God, it's awful. It's just awful.
But, no, it's very impressive. We're so excited to be speaking with you. This is such an important topic to 500 Global. We've been covering ethics in tech quite a bit in our ESG webinars. And I'm really hoping that those listening to this today can walk away with a sense of where to get started. There's a lot of talk about ethics coming down from the top, from the board, from the CEO, infiltrating the whole organization, being woven throughout the fabric of the organization. But how do we get started with that? What does that actually look like? And how do we make sure that we are doing that and get a realistic sense of measurement about how we're implementing ethics?
Good question. Okay, so the question.
Go ahead.
So the question is, how do you put ethics into practice in business?
Yeah, we could start there. I was gonna take it a step back and actually get a sense of how you ended up specializing in this field.
Sure. Whatever you like first. What do you like first?
Let's get to know you a little bit first. So, coming from the world of academia, how did you end up being part of building this field of ethical AI and ethics in tech? And I'm curious who in this field you're most influenced by right now.
So you mentioned during the too long bio that I started a fireworks wholesaling company, and that's actually relevant to how I got to where I am now because I started that business when I was in grad school. It's still going now, by the way. I don't play a role in operating it day to day anymore, but it exists. That explains how I became a mentor to startups when I was a professor. And I looked around at all these students doing these cool new things, these new startups, and I thought, I want to do a cool new thing. I got a little bit jealous is a bit strong, but desirous, let's say. And I thought, okay, but look, I love philosophy. I love ethics. If I were to do anything else, then it would have to be ethics-y related. What does that look like? Well, the most obvious thing is an ethics consultancy. But is there any kind of market for that, right? I'm not some sort of, pie in the sky idealist where I think, oh, everyone just wants to be good. And so I'll just start an ethics consultancy and they'll come. I didn't see a market for it. And so I actually just had the idea in my head for a while. I poked around on the internet every once in a while to see if there was anything like that out there. I didn't really find anything of substance outside of things like ethics committees for hospitals or IRBs. And I didn't think that there was a market until various things started bubbling up in our culture. The Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter. There were scores of articles coming out about how millennials and Gen Zers want to work for companies that prioritize people over profit. Somehow I caught wind of the engineers ringing the alarm bells around the ethical impacts of artificial intelligence, Cambridge Analytica. So you take all that stuff, and I thought, okay, I see what's going on, or at least I had a hypothesis about what was going on. These companies are going to get their asses kicked, frankly, because they need to get their ethical houses in order, because the younger generations are taking it really seriously. They have the power of social media to amplify their voice, which they didn't have a generation ago. But these organizations don't know anything about ethics. They don't know how to think about it, let alone how to operationalize it. But I do. And so that's when I thought, all right, there's something here, there's a market here. And you combine that with a bunch of other social factors, like I was a professor at Colgate, which is a great school, but it's sort of in the middle of nowhere. My wife's career was in Manhattan, and we're really city folk, not country folk. And you can only go back and forth for so long, especially when your second child is on the way. So you take all those sort of personal factors, you take that, seeing what I would take to be something like market indicators, and you take the idea and you say, okay, let's go do this. It makes sense now.
Yep. Yeah, I think there's a huge component where this has definitely entered the collective consciousness at a level that you didn't even see 2 years ago. And I want to get into that and what that means for startups and VCs a little later. But so one thing I'm curious about is who do you find really influential in this field? I would say it's relatively new, right? This idea of ethics in tech as a formal business function.
Sure.
So who are you influenced by right now? And what are some of the bigger trends that are capturing your interest right now? I know that data privacy is a big one, and I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah. Okay. So who's influencing me? The people who influence me are actually the researchers, not the sort of so-called thought leaders. I spent the vast majority of my career in academia reading research, writing research, teaching, publishing, whatever. And in that world, you're best influenced by the people who really know their stuff and getting into the details of that stuff. So what I'm influenced by is the research that I read, not every day, because I don't have that kind of time to read, literally research articles every day, but I do read a lot of research. And so I'm influenced by what researchers and practitioners are, as it were, telling me from on the ground. At least the practitioners are, and the researchers saying, look, here's what we have to say about explainability or bias in AI or blah, blah, blah. So that's what I'm mostly influenced by. I'm influenced by the research more than any single person, and certainly more than any particular thought leader, which is, by the way, is a term that I can't stand. Okay. So that's that. Trends. When I sort of saw that market opportunity, or what I thought, or I had a hypothesis about what the market opportunity was for ethics in business, I put it into two buckets. There's what I still do call organizational ethics, which has to do with how do you create an ethically sound organization. And then there's tech ethics, which is how do you create ethically sound tech products. So those are the two buckets that I started with. And at the time, I just thought I can do all that stuff. That's not a problem, because like I said, I've been doing ethics for over 20 years. It's not completely novel to me. It's slightly novel applications of something that is very well worn and that I'm very familiar with and have taught, blah, blah, blah. So it's not that hard to make the transition, with some exceptions that I'll note. Trends, you're right. I was very early to the game. I think I'm still relatively early to the game. I think we're in the early days of seeing ethics built into business practices. One trend is the ESG trend. Like, you said you do ESG stuff at 500. Yeah, I didn't even know anything about ESG when I was in academia. I went to a conference on sustainability. There's another trend, which to my great surprise, didn't have to do with solely the environment, but had to do with the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals. So what I learned at that conference was two things. Number one, people are talking a lot about sustainability. And of course, as you know, they still are, very much so. But sustainability is, and I could talk more about this if you like, it's just corporate America's way of saying the word ethics without saying the word ethics. It's really weird, right? When you talk about the UN SDGs, people are talking about ending poverty, clean drinking water, equal education among genders, blah, 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 right? So those are ethical goals, straightforward ethical goals. They have nothing to do with sustainability in the literal sense of that term, let alone in the climate change sense of that term. You can sustain oppression and discrimination for quite a long time. In fact, we've done it for the whole history of humanity. So it's not hard to sustain that. So sustainability must mean something else. And the only thing I can think of that possibly means is these are ethical goals that people are afraid to say the word ethics. The other thing that I learned at that conference was about ESG investing, or social impact investing. And when I was at this table with a bunch of senior leaders in the space, just by coincidence, and they said, "Oh, you have." When I told them what I'm doing, they said, "Oh, you have to get to the ESG space. You have to get to the ESG space." I know what it was, so I sort of kicked around that space for 6 months or so, trying to figure out, do I have something to offer here? At the time, I thought no. Now I think a little bit more yes, but that's certainly a trend that's increased. There's some qualifications to that, like you see all these reports. There's no standardization around ESG, as you know, so you see all these headlines like investing in ESG has skyrocketed. And I think, well, no, investing in funds labeled as ESG has skyrocketed. Whether or not those funds are actually ESG in any reasonable sense is another question.
Yeah.
So that's a major, but the sustainability ESG trend has clearly been on the rise for the past few years. And I would say sharp increases in interest over, as you said, the past 2 years. The tech ethics stuff, especially AI ethics, has exploded in the past 3 years. There's a particular focus on the documentary The Social Dilemma is part of that, and shows that one of the concerns is, they say it's around privacy violations. I actually think it's about undermining autonomy, and I just get it wrong. And then in AI ethics in particular, although that's related to the newsfeed that you see on Facebook, the big trends are most obviously biased or discriminatory algorithms, privacy violations, and unexplainable outputs or black box algorithms.
Yep.
So those are the trends that are going on. And there's still the Me Too, the Black Lives Matter, that stuff is still going on in the organizational side of things.
Yep. And for those who are interested in exploring that more, you mentioned Social Dilemma, great documentary. So is Coded Bias, which addresses the racial justice issues and discrimination issues in AI, and how that's proliferating.
Yeah.
And how regulation is not kept ahead of that. So it's actually very interesting where you're positioned, because you're kind of ahead of regulation still. We all see these problems in the pipeline. We just don't know how to manage them yet.
Yeah.
So I do want to get into the data privacy thing, because I know that this is on the mind of a lot of founders, how to tackle this. I know it's something you've spent a lot of time thinking about. So can you just kind of lay a little groundwork for how you're kind of challenging the status quo thinking, or the direction that the status quo thinking is going in around data privacy, which is sort of like more is better, right? Like we have to restrict this. We have to be talking about this. We owe it to users. What in that do you feel what are you challenging within that?
Yeah. So, well, let me explain a little bit about what I think people mean by privacy generally, what they ought to mean anyway. And then I'll say the sort of controversial stuff that where I think that people are just going wrong on this point. So the first thing to say is that when there's talk of privacy, it's usually ambiguous between 3 things. First, there's cybersecurity. So that's just about protecting the data, making sure that only the people who are authorized to have access to that data have that access and can only do what certain things with that data that they're authorized to do. So that's all cybersecurity privacy stuff. Then you have regulatory compliance with things like GDPR and CCPA. So that's are we compliant with the regulations in wherever we operate? And then there's what I would call as an ethical lens or perspective or take on privacy. Now, then the question is, okay, what do we mean by privacy in an ethical sense in this context? So a lot of people think privacy just amounts to anonymity. I'm anonymized. I don't think that's what privacy really means. I can say why in a bit if we want, but I'll just sort of get to the more positive account first. More positive account, as opposed to what it's not, what it is. Privacy is a capacity to be exercised. So you go into your bedroom and you have the capacity, you can exercise the capacity to draw the shades so that people can't see you, which is to say that they don't have access to you. You can also put up the shades, right? You have that power to let people have access or not let people have access. If someone knocks on your door after you close the shades and you let them in, they haven't violated your privacy, or they're not infringing on your privacy, because again, you've exercised that right to let them in and other people not let them in. So privacy shouldn't be seen, I don't think, as a passive state of being according to which you're simply not seen. Privacy is a capacity to be exercised. It's a power that people have to give or not give access at their will. So when it comes to your data, people like to talk about, or at least philosophers like to talk about, and actually Germans like to talk about because it's built into their regulations, informational self-determination. So informational self-determination is analogous to bodily self-determination. Bodily self-determination is you have a right to control what happens in and into your body. That's what roughly bodily self-determination is. Informational self-determination is you have a right to control what happens to and with your data. Okay. So when companies want to think about privacy from an ethical perspective, it's not just a cybersecurity perspective, it's not just regulatory compliance, but it's centrally around, there's other factors here, but it's centrally around how much control you give to users about the data that you are collecting about them, if any. Are you transparent about what data you're collecting about them? Are they opted in or opted out by default for what kind of data you collect about them? Do they have control over opting in or opting out? Do you restrict services based on how much data they give you? So these are the kinds of things that we're thinking about, but at the core of it is the degree of control people have. And more specifically, at a minimum, if you're respecting people's privacy from an ethical perspective, then you're not doing anything to undermine their ability to exercise that power. You're not doing anything to undermine their ability to make certain choices about what happens with and to their data. Social Dilemma is intent on showing that at least at some point, if not still, Facebook routinely undermines that capacity. That would be a way of undermining privacy because they're undermining your ability to exercise that capacity. Or just any company that hides all the controls, 15 layers deep in links. You can control it, but it's so hidden that you'll never find it. That would be a way of undermining that ability to exercise that capacity. On the other hand, at a maximum, you would empower people to exercise that capacity. That would be a maximal respect of their privacy. You do everything that you can to create the conditions under which they can exercise that capacity to control their data without undue burden.
Yep.
Okay, so that's just laying that's all laying the groundwork. I haven't even said the controversial bit yet, but I don't know, how does that sound so far?
No, that's great. It's making me think about we just did an anti-patterns discussion last week with Kat Zoe from Spotify. And it was really interesting. The focus was on anti-patterns in tech and how things can be, the opt-out can be buried behind 4 or 5 different pages. And Amazon in particular is has a rough one. So she went through a few examples, but and I know you've worked with Amazon in the past. So it's kind of taking my mind there and in that world. One of the things that we talked about in that too is that a lot of things are very set up as terms and conditions. So go ahead and read this document if you want. We've provided it, so here it is. Even if it's hyperlinked, but more focus on giving people the information they need at the time they're turning over their data or making a decision, instead of just kind of legalese, throwing it all in a document and saying you've done your part. I don't know if things are shifting from a regulatory perspective around that in particular, but it does seem like the right way of thinking and treating users. And part of that discussion too was sort of a lens shift around your power building tech. And I have a background as a product manager too. So it's, I understand being in that seat. And a lot of times we don't think of how much influence we have just with small decisions we make with product. But these products really do impact people.
There's, one concept that I didn't mention, although it's sort of implicit in some of what I said, is that you ideally, it seems from an ethical perspective anyway, you want to get meaningful informed consent when you're taking people's data and using it in certain ways. And so to your point, if you just bury that in legalese in a 40-page terms and conditions document, you might be getting, in some sense, technically, legally informed consent, but it's not, what some people would call meaningful informed consent. It's not, they don't really know what's going on, even though they clicked, I accept.
Well, let me ask you, what kind of explicit advice do you give startups around this? Because I think the territory we're going into reminds me of something that the chief of ethics at Salesforce said in an interview at one point, Paula Goldman. She said, when you're talking about ethics, whose ethics, right? So when we're talking about ethical frameworks at startups, typically it's the ethics of those building the framework, the leadership of the company. That might not reflect a very broad set of ethics. So what kind of advice would you give startups, like sort of on a tactical level, who are approaching this kind of thing and collecting user data and buying
Yeah.
ads from third party
Okay.
stuff?
Yeah. So a couple of things. There are a few things actually. First thing, we can still, I'm just highlighting that I didn't talk about why I think people talking about privacy is a weird thing to me from an ethics perspective. So we can come back to it. Just flagging it. Second thing, I don't like the question, whose ethics? I think that reflects a lack of understanding of the nature of ethics. So the question is not whose ethics, it's, it really is something like, what are the ethical values or principles that we're going to live by? And what does that look like to live by or up to those principles? Whose ethics? I guess what Paula means is something like different people have different ethical beliefs. Whose ethical beliefs should we abide by? So that's distinct from whose ethics, because it might just be that it could be the case that there's one set of true ethical claims or something like that. And then different people have different beliefs, and some of those beliefs are true and some of those beliefs are false. Okay. Then relatedly, when you ask whose ethics, it makes it sound like, should I go with my ethics or their ethics? But the question, should I go with their ethics or my ethics, which is to say, should I or should we as an organization act in accordance with our ethical beliefs or the ethical beliefs of some other group? That itself is an ethical question. So when you say should, you're saying ethically, you're saying among other things, ethically speaking, is it ethically permissible for me to defer to their ethical views? And it might not be, right? If the KKK says, hey, can you do this work for us? And you say, well, whose ethics? And then you say, well, we're going to go with their ethics. That's an ethical decision you've made. Obviously, you made an ethical decision to defer to that you made the ethical decision that it is ethically permissible to defer to them in matters of ethical import. Okay, so you don't get to escape the ethical position, even when you're deferring to another. That itself is an ethical move that you're making. Okay, the third thing, which is what should companies actually do, especially startups, there's one thing that you can do is you can start articulating your ethical principles early on. And there's a particular way of doing this. Most companies, I think, do this wrong. They do it by saying things like, we're for fairness, we're for privacy, we're for respecting people, and go team, rah, 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 let's make the world a better place. And that's just PR, nonsense. Nonsense is a bit strong, but it's vacuous. It's vacuous is what it is. It's not nonsense, it's vacuous. And it's vacuous because it doesn't commit you to anything in particular.
Yeah.
If you're going to uphold a set of values or have a set of values, then it has to, at a bare minimum, set what the guardrails are. Guardrails for action look like this. Because we value privacy, we will never X. Because we value privacy, we will always Y. And you have to fill in for X and Y in a number of ways, ideally. But when you fill that in, now we're getting a conception of what it amounts to, what your values are. So to take an analogy, people, there's the famous line, don't tell me your priorities, show me your budget, and I'll tell you your priorities. And it's the same thing with this. Don't tell me your ethical values. Tell me what you're committed to doing and not doing, and I'll tell you what your ethical values are.
Yep.
So for instance, we value privacy. That means we will never, I'm just giving some examples, we will never sell data to a third party. We will never when we sell data to a third party, we will always aggregate and anonymize that data. We will, blah, 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 right? You can keep going with these things. Because if not, I'm going to give you my favorite stark example of the vacuity of just affirmations of values. You can say you're for fairness. The KKK says they're for fairness too. They have a very different conception of what that looks like on the ground, how to operationalize it, how to put it into practice. But if you write down on a piece of paper, we're for fairness, your organization can sign it and the KKK can sign it because they are for fairness at that high level of description. So just an appeal to these large, big concepts, big terms, it's meaningless unless it's accompanied by an articulation of the guardrails.
Well, that's super interesting and helpful. And I remember maybe it was 10 years ago, manifestos at startups were kind of the rage, right? It was like, write your manifesto, and following on the heels of the Apple manifesto, stay hungry, all of that.
Yeah.
How do you feel about those we believe statements? Does it fall in this bucket of not operationalizable?
Yeah, I mean, if they say we believe X and that's why we will always, or we never, that's why we do this. Okay, fine, say we believe, but the statement by itself doesn't mean anything. That's the first thing. Another thing to say is that these manifestos, mission statements, all that, they're meant to be, or company values. They're often not values in the ethical sense of that term. They're just things that we do to promote the bottom line. And so we're customer obsessed. Well, what are you customer obsessed for? Because you want them to be happy, so they buy more of your stuff, so you make more money. That's not an ethical value. You want to be customer obsessed. That's good and well, but don't tell me it's an ethical value in any sense.
Right.
Take Facebook. Our mission, I don't know exactly what their mission is, but something our mission is to connect people. Okay, that's great. Who do you want to connect? How are you going to connect them? Are there any kind of connections that are bad connections? Are you going to connect the white supremacists with the Nazis? Are you going to connect is there something that there is an ethically bad connection that you don't want to foster? So if you just say we're for connecting people, that's not an ethical value yet. You haven't filled it in at all.
Yep. Yeah. And I know you're a big advocate of connecting KPIs to ethics statements. So this is drawing a good picture of how this is done.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'm not a great lover of KPIs. In truth, I just think that they're necessary evils to some extent, especially when you're a startup. When you're a startup, don't worry about it. You're close enough, you're on the ground enough to know what's going on. I don't think you need KPIs. When you're 100 people, 200 people, 10,000 people, okay. Now we're getting to a point where we need something like KPIs to make sure that your ethics program is being scaled and maintained appropriately. But yeah, the closer that you can get to articulating what you will and will not do in light of your values, the closer you get to your KPIs.
Let's get back to the data privacy spiral staircase we're going up. Mm-hmm. I'd love to hear more. So you've kind of laid the landscape, defined, set out some of the definitions and common understandings of what this means. What kind of approach, I think we left off at the approach that you're advocating toward data privacy. What's the debate that we're getting into in there? Yeah. What's the controversial piece?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. So remember the way that I'm thinking about, I'm all for cybersecurity. I'm all for people having, limited access to data, or, only people who want to have access to that data should have access to that data, and the right cybersecurity controls need to be in place, and blah, blah, blah. So I'm not saying do away with privacy in the sense that we should do away with cybersecurity. I'm also certainly not saying that we should do away with regulatory compliance and being smart about what those regulations are. But this bit about informational self-determination seems to me just sort of overwrought and misplaced. The first thing to say, and I think privacy experts are mostly okay with it, or are in line with this, is that we can't possibly put the burden on individuals to control their data. It's just too much. It's like, who has the time, the bandwidth, the resources, the interest? It's just so. Do you want, even, let's say, you could have a website that says, here are the companies that have your data in various ways, and now you said how often do you have to go check on it? It's a logistical nightmare, right? So it can't be about that.
Oh, sorry to interrupt you. How are people supposed to understand unintended consequences as well? Right. So.
Yeah, it just requires way too much education and time and skill and knowledge and interest to possibly put the burden on individuals. So informational self-determination seems slightly bonkers to me. And it's really about, can we create the right regulations or laws to make sure that companies don't abuse or harm or wrong people? That's what's important. It's, similarly, I'm not going to understand, I don't know, the rules and regulations that govern credit card companies and what they are and are not allowed to do with regards to interest rates and yada, yada, yada. I don't know what they're doing, but I trust that there are certain consumer protections in place so that consumers don't have to understand it themselves, but the lawyers do and the companies do, and they have to abide by it or they get in big trouble. Here's the more controversial piece. I find it very difficult for me to actually care about my data from a privacy perspective. So first of all, there's a difference between data about me and my data. There might be data about me. It doesn't entail that because the data is about me, it's my data in any meaningful sense. If you observe that I go to Cafe Martin every Monday at 8 a.m. and you write it down in your little notebook, you've got some data about me. It's not my data, it's data about me. But so there's a general inference from there's data about these people to it's their data that is We need more. If that's not a legit inference by itself, you need some more premises. But the other thing is that it just seems like a misplaced concept. I think the real issue is when companies have that data, they can use it in ways to really ethically wrong people, harm them. I don't like the word harm as much as I do wrong, but you can harm them, wrong them, whatever. And that's where our attention should be. So let me give you an analogy. So suppose I'm at work and my colleague, I've got this colleague's name is Achilles. And Achilles, I notice, exhibits some odd behavior that whenever the fire alarm goes off or whatever the alarm is, he covers his ankle. And I'm like, oh, that's weird. This guy keeps covering his ankle every time the alarm goes off. You know what? I bet his ankle is particularly vulnerable for some reason. Sorry, not his ankle, his heel. Not his ankle, his heel. So I say, he keeps covering his heel. I bet his heel is pretty vulnerable. Fast forward, yada, yada, yada. And I find myself in a fight with Achilles. And I go for his heel. I deal the death blow to his heel. And that's it. Okay. It would be weird, I think, for someone to say something like, Reid, you did something wrong there. Not only two things wrong. Not only did you kill Achilles, you also really violated his privacy because you inferred that there was something wrong with his heel. That's bizarre. I didn't violate his privacy. I was observant and I noticed some stuff. I don't think I violated his privacy. So to me, the central issue is not that when we get data about people, that enables us to visit certain harms upon them. But the fact that we've enabled that having that information enables you to do certain wrong things is a violation of privacy in particular. That's just a complete non sequitur. So absolutely, we should protect, this is cybersecurity, we should protect who has access to that data and under what conditions they have access to it and what they're permitted to do with it. But we shouldn't infer from any of that if they don't do that, then privacy is the issue. The issue is the wrongs done as a result of having people's data.
Yep. No, it's interesting. It's an exploitation issue, right?
Yeah.
I feel like, I'm thinking back to some experiences working in tech companies, and that level of exploitation isn't always so binary. It's not always so obvious, right? So, for example, let's get our users to watch as many of these videos as possible, right? Like, there's some social benefit to these videos. People, we're promoting creators and etc. But we're also influencing people to spend more of their time watching these videos and kind of feeding content. So I do think it's really interesting when you get into these situations. It's easier. Hindsight's always 20/20. But when it's all happening and you're building and there's excitement around building, especially at startups, I think it's easy to find yourself on these pathways where ethical frameworks really come into place.
Yeah.
But in my own experience, I've never been in an environment where that was, at a tech company where that was really, where those guardrails were really in place. And we said, people can only watch this many videos. It wouldn't make any sense for the business.
Yeah.
So it kind of gets that quandary quickly.
Yeah. So there are a couple of things to say here. Number one, I think that's right. So right, then the issue is, are we doing something wrong? So it's not a privacy issue. It's, are we manipulating them in such a way that their autonomy is undermined or that they're harmed in some other way, that we're causing emotional harm, addiction, blah, blah, blah. So it's not a privacy issue.
Over indebtedness.
Sorry?
Over indebtedness.
Right, yes. So it's, those are the real things that I'm concerned about, not, oh, that company has some data about me in a data set that literally nobody ever looks at. No person ever looks at. And if they do, they don't even know what they're looking at. And, so privacy just seems silly. It's completely disanalogous to me drawing the shades in my bedroom. That's like, I want to avoid embarrassment or something. I'm not embarrassed because some data about me looking at, I don't know, guitars on Amazon is stored in a data set, that nobody looks at, although it gets fed into some algorithm, that blah, blah, blah. Like, privacy just doesn't seem like an issue. The second thing to say is, you brought up what I think is a familiar and deeply flawed ethical logic that Silicon Valley employs, which is something like, well, we're doing this social benefit, we're promoting the creators, yada, yada. And yes, we're doing this other thing, but there's all this benefit. So there's a kind of, what I would call, maybe this is overly academic, a kind of crass utilitarianism. Like, we take all the good that we're doing, we take all the bad that we're doing, and we add it all up. And if we're on the plus side of things, then we're cool. And if we're on the minus side of things, not cool. And the reason that's crass, for a variety of reasons, but one of the reasons is that that's not how decent ethical reasoning goes. You can do, if you find out that I don't know, I volunteer at homeless shelters and I donate all this money, and you think, oh, he's a great guy, but every other Saturday I murder an innocent person, but no one knows, right? I murder an innocent homeless person. You wouldn't be like, okay, well, let's add up all the good Reid does and take away he loses points because he murders people every once in a while, but they're not really people that anyone knows or cares about. So but you'd be like, no, some things are just wrong, and the wrongness doesn't get offset by all the good that you do. But Silicon Valley thinks that way. They think, okay, there's some benefits and then there's some harms, and how do we balance these out? But some things are just wrong to do, independently of the other benefits. So there's a kind of ethical logic that is just completely, it's bonkers on an individual basis, as you can see, and it's equally bonkers, I think, when it comes to thinking about the impacts of products. If the impact that your product has consists in wronging people, that wronging doesn't get offset by all the good you do, at least in normal standard cases. You might be able to think of some example or other, but.
Yep. There's so much more there if we had time, because I want to get into your thoughts on how attitudes around pushing consumerism on people and stuff like that are changing. But I do want to ask you, one of my questions for you was, I wanted to get into sort of the shift into the VC seat for a little bit. So your thoughts on this: if VCs were investing in the next Google or Facebook today, what would actually be different about their approach, if anything, given the way the world looks now, compared to how it did 15 to 20 years ago?
Yeah. Okay. I don't want to paint too rosy a picture. I'm not going to, tell anyone every company would do better bottom line wise if they acted ethically. I think that's just empirically false. That's just not the world we live in. We don't live in a sort of perfectly just ideal world. We already know that, right? So could there be another something like Facebook that engages in deeply unethical practices and makes shareholders a tremendous amount of money? Of course, that I promise you that will happen again. It's not a question. Will there be companies that make a tremendous amount of money for their shareholders, yada yada, while also doing, if not the right thing, at least not the wrong thing? And in fact, part of their brand and reputation is built on that, which in turn funds, no pun intended, funds their progress. Yeah, that'll exist too. I don't think there's a question about that, because there is a growing market by consumers for companies that don't prioritize profit over people. And to the extent that brands can weave that into their reputation, their brand, not in only a PR way, but in a PR way because the PR reflects what their actual practices are, I think there's going to be a lot of success stories there. And there are success stories. In Patagonia, take Patagonia, for instance. Patagonia is in part successful because being ethical and stewards of the environment is part of their brand. And they have lots to say about what they do to actually walk the talk. So I think VCs, yeah, look, there can be, if you like, purely avaricious or greedy VCs who don't care about any of the ethicsy stuff, and they'll make money, not a question. And then there's going to be some who do care and who also make money. I don't think anyone's going to go. I don't think any VC is going to go bankrupt by investing in a company that's ethical, on the condition that they also have a sound business model, which is table stakes for investment anyway.
Yep. So the field of ethics in tech, where do you think this is headed? So people like you and I had to Google what generation I am, because I'm getting to that age where I'm like, I don't think I'm a millennial. So like Gen Y, if you will, we're kind of the last to remember a world.
Yeah, we might be the same age. Yeah. Yeah, I was born in '79, which I'm not a Gen Xer, but I'm not a millennial. I'm just
just a few, not much.
I'm a weird thing.
Yeah, you're that in between. But we're kind of that last generation that remembers a life of not being inundated with tech. I mean, I was finishing college when Facebook came out. So thankfully. So where do you think this field is going to go as more and more people who never remember that world, that even Instagram world, are entering the workforce, or are entering startups, or entering VCs, where having your face scanned is completely normal to them? or perhaps maybe I'm wrong, maybe they are the questioners, but I'm curious to get your thoughts on where the mass of us are headed with this based on what you've been seeing.
The only thing that I've really seen over the past few years, and maybe this is sort of like observer bias because this is what I'm looking for. But that said, there's no doubt. I don't think anyone could deny, plausibly deny, that there's been a huge increase in consumer and general citizen awareness and concern over the issues. Cambridge Analytica, I mean, every time Facebook does something, it helps to raise awareness. So it's bad, when they do the bad things, but the flip side is it gets consumers and citizens generally more aware and pushing for change. I mean, Congress is talking about, doing what we can to fight biased algorithms. I mean, the topic of discriminatory AI has exploded over the past few years. And not only do we have the federal government talking about it, but we have state and local government entities doing things about it. New York State or New York City just passed something around HR AI software has to be properly vetted for bias, et cetera, et cetera. So it's being taken seriously by government officials at the local, state, and federal levels. And it's only the beginning. Europe is leading the charge, clearly with GDPR. They released draft regulations for AI last April, I think that's right. Or maybe it was the past summer. I don't remember. So they're looking to push for more regulations around it. We're absolutely going to get more regulations around it, and we're going to get increased consumer awareness. Not only that, but it's going to be, I don't think, just AI ethics or data ethics, but blockchain ethics, IoT ethics, AR, VR ethics, metaverse ethics, if that's actually a thing.
Yeah.
But the more that this tech stuff starts permeating our lives, the more people are going to ring the alarm bells, the more documentaries are going to be made, the more stories that reporters are going to write about. And so I don't have a dystopian vision of the world, because I think that there's going to be lots of bad shit, but there's also going to be people pushing against it. And I think that we will be, successful in some areas and will fail in others. And, life will go on.
Well, that leaves us on a really optimistic note. I'm glad to hear that if you're feeling good about it, I'm feeling good about it. When does Ethical Machines come out?
It'll be on shelves in July. I don't know when it's when it's ready available for pre-order. But it's like 99.9% done. And I'm happy to come back and talk about it when it comes out.
That would be great. We would love that.
Yeah.
Okay. Reid, well, it's so nice to be here with you today, and thank you. And look forward to following more of your work in this field.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. Nice talking.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Take care.
Bye, everyone.